Hi, Joe. It's good to see you.
Hi.
I am really looking forward to this conversation. So, just to set the scene, and then I'll let you introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself. So this is going to be a two-part series as part of our
Yes.
Creating the Conditions series of webinars, and I've got the pleasure of interviewing Joe this afternoon and hearing some reflections on learning from yourself. So, do you want to say a little bit about who you are, Joe, and why we are choosing this moment to do this recording?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hayley. Really excited to do these two recordings. Should be a really good conversation between us as we've had in the last 18 months. So I'm currently a strategic director here at GM Moving, but I'm about to move on. I've been offered a new job that I have accepted. And so it's a nice opportunity for us to maybe talk about my reflections together over the last 18 months, to think about all those things ranging from the work to culture to system change to how we do all of those things. And I've certainly learned a lot along the way, and so it'll be a good conversation between us to unpack some of those things.
Brilliant, thank you. And so we're going to have two sort of 20-minute conversations. The first one being quite focused on what it is we're doing and and how we're doing it in a strategic sense. And then the second one being more about the kind of what does that take? What have you found that it takes from you and us as leaders in the work? But I guess my even just hearing your introduction there has taken me back to the day you walked into the interview room and explained who you were and what you were here to do. Do you want to explain just what brought you to GM Moving in the first place and what the role you came in to do and how that evolved? And yeah,
Yeah,
perhaps to reflect from, if you think back to then, what did you think this was and
sure.
what is it actually?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And probably to answer that, you need to take a little bit of a step back from that too. So I'm an economist by background. I think that's useful to set out. I've always led research, policy, strategy kind of functions across different organizations. And with my previous experience being much more within the housing, placemaking, community kind of side. What was really interesting though is I've worked at a range of different organizations in different sectors, and have worked at a think tank, and started thinking that really focused on community power, trying to put communities at the heart of what it was trying to do, trying to make sure that people had powers, budgets, agency, all those kind of good things to affect their own lives, to be in charge of their own destinies in a certain way. And I was entirely struck by this, and particularly my role before working at a think tank was in central government, and so the juxtaposition of those two things was really stark and really formative for me to try and think about how to improve lives, I think. And after working at the think tank, which was New Local, I then started to explore. Well, actually, I need to I need to really learn this by living it a little bit. I've done a lot of writing, a lot of talking about what that could be, what the principles might be, what the focus might be, what those kind of key concepts are, which is all good things to talk about, all good things to think about. But actually, I felt that unless I'd lived it, I wouldn't properly understand what that would mean and what that would look like. And particularly when we start thinking about what does system change therefore look like, and how would you engage with those difficult topics. So this role had come up well, as you say, 18 months ago, as maternity cover, as a strategic director here at GM Moving, covering the health side of the work. And so I thought this would be an absolutely brilliant way for me to learn about and to be immersed by, what the topic is, how do you affect system change, what kind of work do you need to do in order to do that, what does the work actually look like, you get to focus on a particular topic, but how do you connect those topics and so on. And it felt like a really good way for me to be able to add some value from my background, which I was banking on at the time would be valuable and useful to you and your work. But then in return, the quid pro quo would be, wow, I get to learn a lot about, Greater Manchester as a whole that I'd never worked in before, and working across the system to affect some real change. And I learned a huge amount along the way there. But that was really I suppose, the start of the journey, which was great. So casting my mind back, I'm just now thinking about the interview and the interview questions, and they all come back to the fore about presenting in a particular way and talking about different topics and so on and so forth. But yeah, that was the start of the journey.
And I guess sort of fast forward to now and when you look back, if you were to try and describe to somebody just very kind of high level, like quite succinctly, what were the key things that you would reflect on between your idea of what it was and what it is in practice, what would that be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my idea coming into it would be that it would be a combination of skills that are required. So whether that is influencing policy at a regional city, in this example, city region level. So that's the influencing policy and strategy side. It would be understanding place really deeply. That's both at a Greater Manchester whole, but then also understanding the different challenges and circumstances localities and indeed their communities find themselves in, and trying to unpick that. And then applying a series of principles and approaches, and indeed our now, back then it was your, but our deep learning in doing this for many years. And it was the application of that I wanted to learn to then be able to help and affect change. So that's what I thought it was coming in. I thought there would be a strong element of building relationships like there is in any job. And I didn't actually, coming in, I wasn't sure whether that would be any different to any other job in a sense. I think the difference would be that it's significantly more relational than I had anticipated. I thought there'd be, as I say, a strong element of that. But the whole movement for me lives and dies, and now totally understandably, but lives and dies by that relational nature. Can you pick up the phone, connect some dots, connect with an individual, understand what they're trying to achieve, be able to translate what they're trying to achieve into your work, and try and translate your work into how you can help them achieve theirs. And from that, I think then forms the basis of the other things that I spoke about, whether that's policy change or whatever it might be in that deep understanding. So I think maybe my best description of what I thought it was coming in, and then now I've learnt it, is not that the balance of the different types of work were wildly out. I think, there's probably slightly more relational, as I've said, than I'd anticipated coming in. But I think it's the logic chain, the order in which things happen or can happen is different in practice than it was in my head. So a good example of this might be in other roles, other jobs I've had. Obviously, you have your immediate team and your immediate organization, and then you have what we would class as stakeholders out in, what we would call the system. And so you'd work with them. This is the first place I have worked where you genuinely feel like part of your team actually sits outside of the organization. And so that is built on trust, but it's also built on aligning strategies and aligning policy and trying to drive outcomes and so on and so forth, all those really good things. But I think it's that has really opened my eyes to this type of work. And then that then sets the path for influencing change. So if something happens, I pick up the phone and I talk to some people out in the system, as well as internally, of course. Whereas, in previous roles, you might have tried to analyze what that thing is, worked out what that thing is, and then when you pick up the phone, you propose or pitch something. And it's not like that in this. It's much more organic, much more holistic, much more collaborative. And I think those things really came to the fore in my learning over the 18 months. And actually some of that muscle memory of, let me go away and think about this for a little while and I'll come back, which was my entire both education and professional kind of career has kind of been shifted a little bit. Now it's, maybe I should just go and talk to some people first. What are your perspectives? What are you seeing? How do we work together on achieving this? And, I think that's probably partly a reflection of the type of work that we do, but also probably partly a reflection of what leadership looks like when you're trying to improve outcomes for people in the most need. So yeah, there's lots to unpack there, I think.
There's a lot in there. So you're describing it's interesting that you've used like the logic chain, because I think when I think back to the early years of this work, where it was very, very much exploratory, there wasn't an evidence base behind it, and it did feel like the mantra was to go where the energy is. Where it's really interesting that in this moment you can describe that there is a logic to it. There is a logic train or a theory of change, and that will be music to many people's ears, because I think as human beings we do crave some order and structure, don't we? So I was just wondering whether there was a particular example or examples from the work itself where you could really bring that to life. You've talked about being a translator, perspective taking, relationship building, that finding the win-win between the thing the person's interested in and the thing you're interested in. Is there any particular example of a tangible area of work that can kind of illustrate what that means in practice?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few examples and that we could dive into, but the first maybe 12, 13, 14 months or so was me leading on the health side of the work. And I think both that was relatively and still is in its infancy, but growing substantially. I think there's some key elements within that health work that were really important. So there's a translation piece here at a locality level, which is what's happening in communities and how do people want to improve their places, which is partly a place question, partly a community question, partly a social cohesion question. Then there's what's the role of public health or the role of health services more broadly? Those two things aren't necessarily perfectly aligned all the time, and there's different stresses and different priorities, and trying to work out, well, actually, who's responsible in a particular place and what would that look like? And then there's a strategic kind of element of, well, actually, how do what we champion as a physical activity charity, how do we demonstrate to a sector, particularly health, that has its own language, just like any sector has its own language, has its own acronyms, has its own ways, has its own assumed knowledge about things. How do we go about affecting change within that, but bringing our stuff in? And I think lots of our work in that space, whether it's the physical activity champions and so on, and those kind of elements, which is about, well, actually, trying to understand what are the key priorities at a health system level. What are you trying to achieve? What's the language that you use? Because the language that we use, we can help you with that, but the language we use is this, and translating across those things to be able to demonstrate, actually, we want very similar things. We want better health outcomes. We think moving is better. We think the language of movement for individuals can be challenging and a big barrier, and so on and so forth. So breaking those down in quite open conversations, but within a system and within people, has been incredibly important to be able to do that, and then be able to translate, well, what would that mean then at a place level, whether that's a community or a neighborhood or whatever, and they face their own challenges depending on the demographic makeup. So you're constantly layering certain aspects, certain pieces of work, translating between those layers, but also translating between disciplines. And that for me has probably been, just to come full circle to your original question, that for me has probably been my biggest lesson. That's why it's so relational, because it requires so many conversations, and it requires a humility to be able to say, actually, I don't know what you're talking about there. I don't, I'm not don't have a medical background, or whatever it might be. And so you constantly have to ask those questions and pitch and propose what it is that you think could be right. So all those things kind of play together, which I think is really important. The other kind of example I would give is probably slightly more at a strategic level, because I've spoken there about either specific kind of either service or training or whatever it might be in a community and so on. But at a strategic level, that happens exactly the same. So across Greater Manchester, having the, I suppose, the mechanism and the momentum of having live well centres where you're trying to bring lots of different, different services, but it's actually much more holistic than that, into single places within communities to be able to affect people's health and a whole range of different things in a holistic way is a really galvanizing force. But whenever a big idea like that happens, it can sometimes feel like it's you've got a big idea and it's trying to trickle down. And actually, our role within the system is to be able to try and translate some of that, work out, well, actually, what it is that you're trying to do, align some of our strategies, or demonstrate that we're already aligned in this, and let's work together on doing it. So I think those kind of examples really demonstrate the power of, I suppose, relationships and the relational nature of working, but B, it also demonstrates that actually lots of work within the system and across Greater Manchester is done out in the open. And I was not expecting that. Whether it's working in Whitehall or working for a private organization or whatever, you're making a thing, you're building a thing, you're thinking about doing a thing, you're testing it, yes, you're doing some testing behind closed doors, you develop it, and then it's this big reveal that this thing is going to happen. You've built it, and they shall come. And actually, there's some pros to that. There's also a huge number of cons to that. And what I wasn't anticipating, but has become very clear, is across Greater Manchester, lots of these things happen in the open. This is the big idea. We're going to be very open and transparent about the big idea. How do we all work together on it? And please feel free to come with your ideas and thoughts and help. That's a really big change to previous.
That's fascinating, and I guess there's something else which you started to touch on there, which is like this flow of what's happening in places and neighbourhoods and localities, and then what the GM role is in that. But you've done an awful lot while you're here to help to like feed that up, because we've been through in quite a big phase of government consultations and so on. So
yes,
you were sort of smiling about some of the pros and cons of the Whitehall ways of working. What are you seeing? You've engaged a lot in that, trying to make sure that the learning is fed from the bottom up. What have you learned about that, and what do you think, I suppose the sort of value of that is, and for the future as well?
Yeah, so great question. So I think this is the biggest opportunity. It doesn't come without risks, but I think it's the biggest opportunity for both, GM moving, but also GM as a whole, actually, and being able to influence as much as possible upwards and outwards. So, I think there's a couple of things. The first is, if we go back to the logic chain for a moment, there's you've got that relational focus. You can align those priorities, you align the strategies, you have that collaboration to deliver great work, and then you evaluate and you do some reflective kind of practice to make sure that you understand you're continually learning. That as an approach that we take, that the system takes, with lots of feedback loops within that. It's not a single linear chain, of course, but there's certainly a chain within it. That as an approach is really important, I think, for what we are as a centralized kind of system within the UK to learn from. The devolution story and the devolution momentum is not going to hold back, and I'm the cards on the table here is I'm a big supporter of devolution, and I think it's right, and I think powers and budgets should be devolved to those most affected by it. But in order to do that, we need to be able to make the best possible case and continually make the best possible case. And part of that is demonstrating and delivering impact, which we can unpack. Part of that, though, is also about the how, the approach, and what that requires and what it takes, and what kind of system do we need to operate in order to get the most out of that. And I think that a government, any government this would be of any kind of colour, would be really keen to hear about how that works in practice, how they can let 1,000 flowers bloom, what are the kind of things that they need to be able to help create the conditions for more of this activity to work and happen, and then what that impact actually looks like. So I think there's a couple of things I'd flag. The first is we have a rich and deep kind of knowledge base, and coming in 18 months ago, and I would say that I've only scratched the surface of the knowledge, if I'm honest, but those years, decades of properly understanding what works is that we as GM Moving, it has a real gold mine of information and research and intelligence and so on to be able to draw upon, and we shouldn't be shy from that. But our work obviously sits within the system, and the system as a whole has this huge understanding of what it takes to be able to do this. So drawing out impact and what that looks like for communities and telling those stories in that to use that phrase is really important. But it is also about the how, because the how requires careful stewardship from all forces. The impact doesn't happen overnight. So if those are the two things, which we can unpack in a moment if you wish, but if those are the two things, one of the big things I would, and I've tried to champion, and you might wryly smile at this, is being louder and prouder. I think we're at the stage of the organisation and system maturity to be able to be very proud about what we've achieved, what you've achieved, what we've achieved. And I think having that clarity and having that assurance and telling the system and telling, the system in its broadest sense that this is who we are, this is what we've done, this is what we think works, this is what we think doesn't work, I think is a really important process for us to go through. And I would, encourage that continuation of being louder and prouder, because you do have a depth of knowledge at a local level, you do have a strategic knowledge at a GM level, and you have something to offer in those big social challenges that we face to offer to central government. There's everything in between. We have something to offer, and I think it's very powerful.
And that's such a important thing to be able to then do, isn't it? And we talked a lot in this work about how you a huge picture, a breadth and depth of the picture of everything that's going on in communities across Greater Manchester, in the whole sort of GM layer, as well as all of the stuff that's going on in all the 10 places. And then and I'm going to challenge you in a minute, so give you some thinking time, but when you bring all that together and draw that up into a single clear and compelling story that you would tell a Whitehall colleague about this work, what is it you would say? If you just had, I hate the elevator pitch, but if you didn't have long,
yes,
what is it you would go back and go, well, I've been in Greater Manchester for 18 months and this is what they're doing and this is how and this is why it's important. Like, is there a clear and compelling story you could tell?
I'm very pleased you asked this, because I actually haven't prepared this at all. So thank you for the very difficult, challenging question to develop an elevator pitch on our chat. So in all seriousness, I think there are a few things to kind of focus on. The first is what is the commonality? This is how I would think about designing that. What is the commonality? Because if we are to assume that all places are different and they all face different challenges, which I am happy to assume, I think that is absolutely right. What is the commonality about this type of work in different places that we can champion? And there are some cores. We've done a huge range of different work, whether it's on the NELP or the conditions for change and all these kind of things, which is really important. But there are some commonalities. There's collaboration, there's strong leadership, there's a vision, I think, that's set. There's an approach and a way of working that requires humility and an understanding of different communities and place and so on and so forth, and taking that much more holistic approach. So everything is connected, to use that phrase, and we should be unashamed in using that phrase, I think. And that would kind of set the tone for what is the commonality here. I think there's some other things though that I would flag. There is probably some work to do when I'm thinking about impact. I want to be able to produce a piece of evidence of some form, and that is notoriously, I mean, it's difficult, period, right? But it's incredibly difficult when there are so many different places, so many different communities with different interventions happening or different activities happening or whatever it might be, that it's very difficult to say, oh, and therefore we've improved lives by X%. It's not really like that. But I would, to walk to the middle in a Whitehall kind of sense here, what would I try to achieve? In an ideal world, I would like to be able to, use evaluation and research to be able to identify impact in a quantitative sense, not solely in a quantitative sense, but in a quantitative sense. And don't be afraid to think quite small at a small geographical level there. Because then in an ideal world, I would like to either take an aggregation of lots of small things that are happening in order to make a pitch that this is a wider impact, or aggregate wider impacts more broadly, or indeed, extrapolate from a certain sample of which we've taken to be able to say this has been the improvement. And that improvement could be compared to a baseline, it could be compared to a comparator place, it could be compared to what the trend would have been without it, and so on and so forth. There's a whole range of different methods and ways. And the important thing within that, I think, is that there is no silver bullet on the analytical quant side that can convince people here. And decisions at Whitehall in particular are made partly on the basis of evidence, partly on the basis of, political drive and trying something new. So the combination of those things, you don't have to answer everything perfectly, but you do have to be able to demonstrate. And so I'd use the combination here of here's the common approach that we would want to see. Here's the conditions of which we would want to see it. If you take those things, our best guess to date of the aggregated improvement is the following. And I think that would be a compelling statement in a 2-minute kind of elevator ride to be able to say, well, actually, and let's start the conversation. The thing I'd always end with in this sense is, if you got trapped or not trapped, but using an elevator, with a minister or something like that, is I want to give them enough to pick up the phone later. And what would I give? And I think my pitch would be, there is so much more we could do. We just need better conditions to be able to do it. And I think it's that will help unlock different things, and that is policy from a range of different departments. And I think we, as system change organizations, and then the system as a whole, need to be unashamedly clear about what changes we would want to see at a central level in order for us to do more.
That leads really nicely onto the probably last question I was going to ask you for this little section, which is, what are your hopes and aspirations for where we go next? And I guess in that you might extrapolate a little bit on the kind of, what is it that we should be asking for in those conditions to do this work into the future as you depart? What do you wish for us?
That's nice. So it's probably some maybe short-term strategy, or maybe even tactics I'd probably describe, and then some longer-term kind of strategic questions I would ask. So on the short term, either short-term strategy or maybe tactics, I would think the following things. The first is, I think there will be a resurgence and an increased importance recognized around public health. And public health working, and that's both within individual teams within councils, but it can also be more broadly about the principle. And I think some of the narrative actually around what have we not learned sufficiently from COVID, could we start dialing up again? Because I feel like in many ways, and actually for many people in many communities, feels like we've not sufficiently taken the learning from that period. So I think there's something there about public health and the rise of that, and I think there'll be a drive for that. The second is have a relentless focus on devolution, because I think that will be the most important game in town, both for Greater Manchester, but for places across the country. You know, if you making sure that anything that you want to do, or any impact that you demonstrate, can help make the case for further devolution and improve settlement or whatever it might be, I think that will be to a benefit of the system and for our sector more broadly. I think that the final thing I'd say is just be, again, coming to that phrase around being louder and prouder. I think there's a real need or a recognition that the ways of working within GM Moving and GM in particular, which is my experience, can be dialed up in a comms kind of perspective. And I think from a policy, working out what policies could be kind of shaped or shifted in order to do more of this work, I think would be to a benefit. And I would encourage everybody to think very, very broad there. You know, that could be a health related thing, so the Department of Health and Social Care. Within that, that's a huge department by itself, focusing on, well, what's the social care element of our work? Could be a really interesting thing. It could be DWP and welfare and the element, all the elements regarding that. Could be DCMS, obviously with a related sport focus, but also a grassroots community focus. Think as broad as you possibly can, and I would suggest that you can find a nice connecting point to our work for them. So those are the kind of things, you know, actually just very briefly, I would say, having worked at a think tank or a couple of think tanks before, you know, if I was still working in a think tank like that, I'd absolutely want to be talking to you because you guys have the knowledge and the experience of what it requires to do this work and what more you need. And if you get to be able to, you know, talk to think tanks and other organizations that are building a, you know, for want of a better phrase, a lobbying position or setting out a stall for a particular position, that would be to a benefit. And I think, you know, if you hook that onto devolution, that would be really good. These slightly long-term strategic kind of questions that I've been thinking about are things like, what are the big issues facing communities and how do you contribute to that? And that is both short-term, but also think long-term. So the short-term things I think are quite obvious and we live that day to day. The long-term things I think are things like aging population, different places being affected in different ways. You know, obviously within GM that's absolutely the case. If you're thinking nationally, coastal communities will face a real challenge. So there's a whole range of different things there. So having a relentless focus on what communities will face will be really important. Again, coming to that point, being relentless about understanding what kind of policy changes you'd like to see for that wider condition. And I think for me, those wider policy changes would be a greater devolution of powers and budgets, less stringent kind of ring fencing, and having more flexibility, having cross-departmental working. And that's not only in a budget sense, that's also in a, I need to convene this group of people from these departments to talk about the following thing. And it makes sense to do that at a place level, but being more involved in that space, I think will be really important. I always think as well, we talk about the system as being an ecosystem rather than a machine. So you don't pull a lever, right? You water the garden, you maintain the garden, which I entirely support. To kind of use a tangential kind of analogy there too, I often think of the system almost like chainmail. Like we're all connected in some way, and you can see the links to it. My question to you would be which links are a bit looser than other links at the moment? Because the whole thing only works if we all stay strong and we're connected really strongly. And there are some elements that naturally, for a whole bunch of reasons, might get a little bit loose. Try and focus on that. And my final 2 points, very briefly. The first, and this might be my own personal revealing my own personal difficulty here. For Greater Manchester, or Greater Manchester Moving in particular, how does one, and does one need to, but how does one separate Greater Manchester Moving and Greater Manchester Moving in action, in a sense? I.e., when do you talk about you as an organisation versus when you talk about the movement as a whole? Because I think that will be really important in order to, when you're in those rooms, who are you speaking from at a particular point will be really, really useful. Although, full disclosure, I think that has been my weakest thing, because I've always like, oh, I'm talking about both here, I think, and so on. So that's probably more of a reflection for me. My absolute final thing I'd love to see you push on with is there is a huge role coming up for placemaking. Connecting placemaking. I think placemaking is the glue or the bridge, whichever analogy you want to use here, between lots of different topics. When I think about health and movement, it's placemaking. When I think about people living good lives, it's about housing and placemaking. Like, placemaking has been left, and that's an age-old problem. For me, planners have become more development control than full visionary kind of planners, in a sense. I think we as an organization, and then the system as a whole, has a role to dial that up a little bit and think, well, actually, placemaking has a big role, and physical activity should form a huge part of that. What does that look like for places?
Where you're going next.
Yes.
Well, in both respects, really, we're going to move on into a conversation around organizational role. And I wouldn't say it's a weakness, actually, to be in a room and holding both of those perspectives for the movement and the organisation interchangeably, but very clearly and distinctly different things. But anything you'd like to share with us before we pause on where you're going next and the role and contribution you're going to make this agenda from your new role and your new perspective?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I'm about to become a director at a very large consultancy called Colliers, which is all about, I suppose it's a real estate investment organization and consultancy that tries to encourage and incentivize big investors to come in and invest in the residential offer in different places. And as a result, that has a huge implication on what do places look and feel like. What does regeneration look and feel like? Are you serving the needs of those communities? What does that, what does the design look like? So on and so forth. So yes, I will absolutely still champion 100% the Greater Manchester Moving, both organisation and movement, from my new position, because it's really very important. But yes, I'm looking forward to using all of these kind of skills, going back into a housing kind of space, and now I truly do get to marry my economic and research background with a whole system change kind of perspective, and hopefully that will be to the power.
I look forward to the contribution you will make in that role. So thank you for that episode. I'm really looking forward to the next one. We're going to take a slight pause now, and then we'll come back to talk about the organisational role and the sort of culture and the conditions that need to be created to enable people make their contribution. So thank you.
Super. Thanks, Hayley.